The city was a vibrant mix of history, culture, and breathtaking sights. It was a place where the old and new danced in harmony, from the ancient stone buildings to the modern cafes lining the streets. The air was filled with the hum of tourists and locals, all moving through the city's heart, caught up in its charm. Amidst the busy crowd, one man stood out. His name was Alex, a tourist who had traveled from far away to explore the wonders of this historic city. Alex had always been fascinated by history, especially the kind that involved royalty and grand traditions. He had read about the royal guards stationed at famous landmarks, their disciplined presence a symbol of power and prestige. Today, he found himself standing in front of one of the city's most iconic sites, a monument surrounded by tall stone walls and grand gates, where royal guards stood like statues in their bright uniforms. Their horses, equally magnificent, were part of the scene, majestic animals with well-maintained coats and striking postures. They looked almost like living pieces of history, standing proud and unmoving as if they were part of the architecture itself. Alex's excitement was palpable. He had seen royal guards in pictures, in documentaries, but now he was face to face with them. He couldn't resist the urge to take a closer look, to capture the moment on his camera. He wanted a picture that would make his friends back home envious. Stepping closer, he carefully positioned himself, trying to get the perfect shot. The guards, however, stood still, their eyes forward, showing no sign of acknowledgement. At first, Alex didn't understand why they remained so rigid. The horses, although calm, seemed to have an air of caution. He hadn't given much thought to the fact that these guards weren't just there for show. They were part of a very serious tradition, a symbol of the royal family's authority and a reminder of the country's history. But Alex wasn't focused on that. He was caught up in his own excitement, snapping photos and edging closer to the horses, eager to get an even better shot. He wasn't being rude, at least not intentionally, but there was something in the air that he had yet to understand. A tension, an invisible line drawn in the sand that he was getting dangerously close to crossing. As he moved closer to the horses, the guard nearest to him suddenly turned his head. His sharp gaze landed on Alex, and there was a brief, almost imperceptible shift in the air. It was a warning, a silent command to stop. Alex noticed the guard's gaze, and for a moment, he thought the man might be posing for a picture, or that the guard was simply keeping an eye on him, like a security officer would. But that wasn't the case. The guard's eyes narrowed slightly, his posture tightening, as if he was preparing for something. Alex, oblivious to the seriousness of the situation, took another step forward. He raised his camera, completely unaware that he was now trespassing into a realm of strict protocol. The horse shifted, its head jerking to the side. Alex didn't notice this at first. He was too focused on the shot he wanted, the angle he needed, and the excitement that came with being so close to something he had only seen from a distance before. He didn't think about the fact that these horses were trained to be very sensitive to movement, that their reactions could be unpredictable if someone was too bold or too close. The guard stepped forward, his hand raised in a calm but firm gesture. His voice was low, carrying an authority that Alex had not yet recognized. "Please step back," the guard said, his tone firm but not harsh. "You are too close to the horse." His words were meant to be a polite reminder, an instruction, but to Alex, they sounded almost like part of the act, as if the guard was simply playing his role in the grand performance of royal tradition. Instead of heeding the warning, Alex smiled and waved off the guard's words. He thought he could take one more step, just one more, to get a picture that was truly unique. After all, he thought, what could go wrong? The guard had spoken, but surely this was all part of the experience. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just wanted a photo that would make his friends think he had gotten the inside scoop, the kind of shot that showed he had been close enough to touch the royal guard's horses. Without giving it another thought, Alex moved closer, his camera still raised. The horse's ears flicked back, a sign that it was becoming uncomfortable with the close proximity of the tourist. It was a warning, a message sent from the animal to the human that something was wrong. But Alex, caught up in the moment, didn't see it. His mind was on the perfect picture, the perfect shot. He was oblivious to the fact that he had crossed a line that, once crossed, couldn't easily be undone. The guard's posture stiffened further. His hand was still raised, this time more urgently. He repeated the warning, but this time there was something more in his voice, a note of finality, a sign that this wasn't just a polite suggestion. Alex, in his pursuit of that perfect moment, didn't hear it. And so, the stage was set for what would follow. An action that would come far too quickly for him to anticipate. An event he would remember for the rest of his life. At that moment, Alex had no idea that a simple step too far could change everything. He was still unaware of how powerful the consequences of his actions would be. Alex didn't fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. He had always been the kind of person who loved adventure and the thrill of exploring new places. He had traveled all over the world, capturing moments with his camera, never really worrying about rules or boundaries. For him, every new city was just another adventure waiting to be discovered, and today was no different. He was caught up in the excitement of being so close to royal guards, those figures of historical authority that he had only ever seen in pictures and books. When the guard spoke to him, Alex thought it was nothing more than a simple instruction. Maybe the guard was just doing his job, trying to make sure that tourists didn't get too carried away. He had seen plenty of guards at famous landmarks before, and they usually didn't mind a quick photo. It was just part of the experience, right? Alex's mind was focused on his next shot, and he didn't really pay attention to the tone in the guard's voice or the way the horse was reacting. His focus was on the horse's magnificent mane, the gleam of its coat in the sunlight, and the regal look of the guard's uniform. He wanted to capture that image, one that would make anyone who saw it stop and marvel at the beauty and grandeur of the moment. But the guard, still standing tall and unyielding, didn't step aside or smile in acknowledgement. Instead, he repeated the warning with a little more firmness in his voice, his posture even more tense now. He didn't move an inch, standing like a statue as his eyes never left Alex. Alex, for his part, still didn't understand the gravity of the situation. He just saw a soldier doing his duty, and he thought, maybe this was just part of the act. After all, the guards were famous for their stoic faces and rigid discipline. To Alex, it seemed like a game, and he was getting caught up in the thrill of it. "Step back," the guard said again, his voice slightly louder now, more serious. But it wasn't the guard's voice that finally caught Alex's attention. It was the horse. As Alex moved just a little closer, the horse let out a soft snort and flicked its ears back, a sign of irritation or nervousness. The powerful animal's muscles tensed under the saddle, and Alex could sense that something was not quite right. But he didn't stop. His camera was raised, his finger ready to snap that perfect shot. In his mind, he was just one click away from capturing the moment of a lifetime. What Alex didn't understand was the powerful bond between the royal guard and his horse. These animals weren't just there for decoration. They were highly trained and sensitive, capable of sensing the smallest change in their environment. The horse wasn't just a statue. It was a living, breathing being, one that needed to be treated with respect and care. And right now, Alex was too close for comfort. The guard's eyes flashed for a moment. His training kicked in, and he knew he needed to act quickly. With a sharp movement, he stepped forward, his boots clicking against the stone ground as he positioned himself between Alex and the horse. His arm shot out, not to touch Alex but to create a clear barrier. His hand was open, palm facing outward, a clear sign that Alex needed to stop. Alex paused for a split second, unsure if he had crossed some invisible line. The air between them seemed to grow thick with tension. The tourist, still oblivious, lowered his camera just slightly. He looked at the guard, whose face remained emotionless, but whose eyes were now filled with warning. Alex took another step forward, trying to get a better angle. He had been warned, but in his mind, it seemed like just a minor obstacle. The guard's eyes narrowed. "I said, step back," he repeated, his voice now firm, almost commanding. There was no mistaking the seriousness in his tone. The horse shifted again, its hooves scraping against the cobblestone, its body stiffening. It was clear that the animal was becoming more agitated by the minute, and the guard knew that he had to stop Alex before things escalated any further. But Alex, still caught up in his own world, ignored the warning once again. He was so close now that he could almost feel the heat radiating from the horse's body. The sight was mesmerizing. He didn't think twice about the guard's repeated requests. His mind was clouded by the desire to get the shot, to get the picture that would make his friends back home jealous. He was certain that no harm would come from just a few more steps. After all, the guard hadn't done anything yet, hadn't physically stopped him. So why should he stop now? The guard's frustration began to grow. He had seen it before. Tourists who didn't understand the boundaries, who thought that everything was for the taking. But these guards weren't just here for a show. They had an important duty to uphold, and that included protecting the royal horses, which were part of the monarchy's heritage. The situation was becoming tense. The guard took a deep breath and stepped closer to Alex, placing himself directly between the tourist and the horse. His posture was rigid, a clear sign that this was no longer a simple interaction. At that moment, Alex finally started to sense that something was wrong. But by then, it was too late. The horse, already on edge, had been pushed to its limit. The guard was doing his best to stay calm, but Alex's repeated disregard for the rules had set the stage for something much more serious than he could have imagined. As Alex glanced up at the guard one last time, he saw a flicker of something in the guard's eyes, something that made him realize that he had made a huge mistake. But it was no longer about the picture or the shot. It was about respect, about understanding that not everything in the world was meant to be controlled, captured, or owned. Alex's arrogance had clouded his judgment, and now the consequences of his actions were about to unfold. The air had changed. It was thicker now, filled with tension, and Alex could feel it. His hand was still gripping the camera, but the excitement that had been there just moments ago had started to fade. The realization of what was happening began to settle in, but it was still hard for him to grasp. He had never intended to disrespect anyone. To him, this was all part of the adventure, something that could be laughed about later with friends. But as the guard stepped even closer, Alex started to understand that this was more than just a photo opportunity. It was something serious. The guard's presence became even more imposing. His uniform, crisp and unyielding, made him look every bit the part of the disciplined soldier he was. The way he stood, tall and unwavering, left no room for negotiation. Alex had been warned multiple times, yet here he was, still trying to get that perfect shot, still ignoring the guard's signals to back away. The guard's eyes were no longer cold or indifferent. They were sharp, filled with authority, and for the first time, Alex felt the weight of those eyes. The horse, standing just a few feet away, shifted again. Its large, powerful body moved slightly as if sensing the rising tension. Its ears twitched back again, a clear sign of unease. The horse wasn't just an animal. It was a creature trained to sense its surroundings, to read body language, to react to the slightest change in its environment. It was used to discipline, used to staying calm in the face of crowds and noise. But the horse was also a living being, with instincts of its own, and it was clearly feeling threatened. Alex finally looked down at the horse, seeing the subtle signs of agitation. The horse's breathing had quickened, and its muscles were stiffening. He noticed the way its eyes darted between the guard and himself. This wasn't the same calm animal he had seen in the pictures. It was alert, on edge, ready to react. The thought crossed Alex's mind. What if something went wrong? For a brief moment, Alex hesitated. He looked at the guard's face, expecting to see some kind of understanding, maybe a smile that said, "It's okay, You've learned your lesson." But instead, there was nothing but determination in the guard's eyes. This wasn't a game. This wasn't about making the moment memorable for a tourist. This was about maintaining order, about protecting the safety of the Royal Guard's horse, and about respecting the boundaries that were in place for a reason. The guard's voice rang out once more, this time louder and with more force. "Step back now," he said, a note of finality in his words that made Alex realize this wasn't a suggestion anymore. The guard wasn't asking. He was demanding. It was clear that the situation was no longer under Alex's control. The discomfort that had started as a slight nagging feeling in Alex's stomach had now turned into full-blown anxiety. He could feel the guard's authority, the power that came with his role, and the sharp, powerful presence of the horse, which seemed ready to react at any moment. Still, Alex didn't move. The camera, still hanging from his neck, felt heavier now, almost like an anchor. It was as if the device that had once been his tool for capturing memories had now become a symbol of his foolishness. He had gotten so caught up in the idea of taking the perfect photo that he had completely ignored the warning signs around him. And now, the moment he had been chasing was slipping away from him, just out of reach. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how wrong he had been. As he stared at the horse, he saw the animal's nostrils flare as it took in a sharp breath. That was when Alex realized how close he was to a disaster. Horses, no matter how well trained, were not immune to fear or frustration. In that moment, Alex could see how easily everything could go wrong. One wrong move, one wrong step, and the horse could lash out. He didn't want to find out what that might feel like. The thought of being hurt, of becoming a part of the spectacle rather than simply observing it, made Alex's stomach twist with anxiety. Just as he was about to step back, the horse made its move. It wasn't a full-blown charge or a dangerous kick, but the horse did something that Alex hadn't expected. The animal shifted its body, pushing back against the guard's reins, and in doing so, knocked Alex off balance. For a brief second, Alex felt the weight of the horse's body and the movement of its powerful legs as they shifted to the side. The sudden motion threw Alex off balance, and he stumbled backward. His legs tangled as he tried to regain control. The force of the movement wasn't meant to hurt him. It was just a warning, a signal from the animal that it had reached its limit. But Alex, now feeling the physical reaction from the horse, was shocked. He never expected that a simple moment of curiosity could lead to this. As Alex regained his footing, he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. The reality of the situation hit him all at once. The horse hadn't attacked him, but it had made its point clear. Alex had crossed a line, and while the consequences weren't as severe as they could have been, the danger was real. The guard, his face still expressionless, looked at Alex, but this time there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something that wasn't anger, but rather concern. Alex took a step back, realizing that it wasn't just the guard he had to respect, but the horse too. The powerful animal was not something to be taken lightly, and neither was the position of the guard. He had made a mistake, and now he had to face the reality of it. As he finally stepped away, the adrenaline in his system began to ebb, and he felt the sting of his own foolishness. He had learned his lesson the hard way, and while the situation had not escalated to something worse, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had come dangerously close to making a serious mistake. He had been warned, and now he could only hope that the lesson would stick. Alex's heart was still racing as he took a step back, trying to regain his composure. The horse's movement had caught him completely off guard. His legs felt wobbly, and for a moment, he stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do next. The guard was still standing in front of him, unyielding and calm, but there was a new sense of authority in his posture now. The silent message was clear. Alex had pushed things too far, and he needed to understand the seriousness of the situation. As Alex backed away, he could feel the eyes of onlookers on him. A few people had stopped to watch the exchange, and some of them seemed to find the situation amusing. Alex, however, didn't find it funny at all. He could still hear the pounding of his own heart in his ears, and he could feel his cheeks flush with embarrassment. He had been so caught up in the excitement of the moment that he hadn't fully considered the risks of his actions. Now he was painfully aware of how close he had come to making a major mistake. The guard hadn't moved an inch. His posture remained straight and disciplined, and his expression didn't change. Alex glanced up at the soldier, but the man's face was still expressionless. The moment had passed, but the tension between them lingered in the air. Alex realized that this wasn't just about taking a picture anymore. It was about respect. He had crossed a boundary, and the consequences of that were only starting to sink in. As Alex took a few more steps back, he looked around, trying to gather his thoughts. The bustling street that had once seemed so full of life now felt distant. The laughter of tourists and the sound of nearby street vendors seemed to fade as Alex focused on what had just happened. He had nearly been hurt, and worse, he had disrespected the royal guard and the horse. The reality of the situation was settling in, and Alex couldn't help but feel a wave of regret wash over him. The horse, now standing a few feet away, seemed to have calmed down. Its powerful body was still, but Alex could see that it was alert, its ears twitching slightly. It was a beautiful animal, majestic and strong, but it wasn't just a statue or a prop for tourists. The guard's horse had its own instincts, its own reactions, and Alex had learned the hard way that those instincts could be unpredictable. Alex couldn't help but feel a sense of awe as he looked at the horse now. It wasn't just part of the scenery, it was an integral part of the ceremony, a living, breathing creature with its own needs and boundaries. Alex realized how close he had come to making things much worse. The horse had only reacted to the pressure of being too close, but if he had continued pushing, who knew what could have happened? A panicked animal could easily have caused harm, even unintentionally. Alex could feel his stomach tighten at the thought. He had never considered the possibility of something going wrong in such a harmless situation. The idea of getting kicked or trampled by the powerful animal sent a chill down his spine. The guard, still standing tall, seemed to be waiting for Alex to calm down. There was no anger in the man's eyes, but there was something else, something that Alex couldn't quite place. It wasn't impatience, but it was a quiet expectation, as though the guard was waiting for him to show some understanding. Alex took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had learned his lesson, but he knew it wasn't enough just to back away. He needed to acknowledge what he had done wrong, and he needed to show the guard that he understood. For a moment, Alex stood there, thinking about how foolish he had been. He had thought that the rules didn't apply to him, that the guards and their horses were just part of the show. But now he understood that this wasn't just a performance for the tourists. This was real, and there were real consequences for his actions. The moment of excitement had passed, and all that was left was the sharp sting of embarrassment. Alex took another step back, this time more slowly, more deliberately. He didn't want to make the same mistake twice. As he moved away from the horse, he found himself looking at the guard, who still hadn't moved. Alex finally spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I'm sorry," he said, his words sincere. He wasn't just apologizing for getting too close to the horse. He was apologizing for not respecting the boundaries, for not understanding the situation before it had escalated. The guard gave him a brief nod, but his face remained unreadable. There was no smile, no sign that the tension between them had dissipated, but Alex didn't expect that. The guard's job wasn't to comfort tourists. It was to ensure the safety of the horse, to uphold the rules, and to protect the dignity of the ceremony. The man didn't need to offer forgiveness. He had already done his part by calmly handling the situation. As Alex backed away, he could feel the weight of the moment lingering in the air. The guard's horse was still watching him, its eyes calm but alert. The animal had gone back to standing still, but it was clear that it hadn't forgotten the disturbance. It was a reminder that respect for animals, for traditions, and for boundaries was something that needed to be earned, not assumed. Alex had learned that lesson in the hardest way possible, but he was grateful for it. He knew that he would never make the same mistake again. The moment felt heavier than it had before, and Alex realized that he was no longer just a tourist snapping pictures. He was part of a much bigger picture, one that involved respect, tradition, and understanding. And that understanding would stay with him long after he left the historic site behind. As he walked away, the sound of the streets seemed to return to normal, but Alex couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him. The lesson he had learned was a valuable one, and it would stay with him for the rest of his travels. As Alex stepped back, his mind was still racing, processing what had just happened. He could feel his legs shaking slightly beneath him, his body still reacting to the adrenaline that had surged through him moments before. The bustling crowd around him seemed distant now, as though he had been pulled into a different world, a world where he was faced with the consequences of his own actions. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but the weight of his mistake lingered, heavy on his shoulders. The guard remained as still and stoic as ever, his presence unwavering. Alex couldn't help but notice how composed the soldier was. The guard hadn't raised his voice, hadn't reacted with anger or frustration, but there was a quiet authority in his demeanor that made Alex feel small and foolish. The guard had done his job, maintaining control in the situation, and had done so with such professionalism that Alex almost felt embarrassed by his own behavior. He had crossed a line, and it wasn't just the guard or the horse who had felt that tension. It was everyone watching. Alex glanced around, his eyes meeting the faces of a few onlookers who had been watching the interaction unfold. Some of them were still looking at him, but their expressions had changed. They weren't laughing anymore, and they weren't amused by the scene. Instead, there was a quiet understanding in their eyes, as if they, too, had witnessed a lesson being learned the hard way. Alex's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. He could feel the heat of it creeping up his neck as he realized that he had not only embarrassed himself, but he had also disrespected the traditions of the Royal Guard. He looked back at the horse, still standing calm and composed, its powerful frame now relaxed. The horse's eyes seemed to follow him as he moved away, but there was no aggression in its gaze. Instead, Alex saw a quiet dignity, the kind of dignity that came from an animal trained to perform with precision and grace. He had underestimated the power of that training, and it was something that had become clear to him only after the close call. Horses, like the Royal Guard, weren't just props in a display. They were an integral part of a centuries-old tradition. They were not to be treated carelessly, and he had been foolish to think otherwise. A feeling of guilt washed over him as he realized how close he had come to making things worse. It wasn't just the risk of injury that had him shaken. It was the realization that he had been disrespectful, that he had failed to see the importance of the ceremony and the people involved. He had thought the guard was simply doing his job, but now he saw that there was more to it. The guard's duty was not just to protect the horse. It was to uphold the honor of the tradition, to make sure that people like Alex understood the boundaries that had been set for a reason. Alex turned his attention back to the guard, who still stood firm, his eyes trained ahead, unblinking. For a moment, there was silence between them. Alex could feel the weight of the soldier's presence, and he felt a deep sense of regret for having been so careless. He wanted to apologize again, but the words felt inadequate. What could he say to make up for his thoughtlessness? What could he say to make it right? But the guard didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The message had been clear from the beginning. Alex had ignored the boundaries, but now he understood their importance. He had learned a lesson, and there was no need for further reprimands. The guard's silence spoke volumes. It was a reminder that sometimes actions speak louder than words, and that respect had to be earned, not demanded. As Alex slowly made his way further away from the scene, he couldn't help but feel the sting of the moment. He had crossed a line, but it hadn't been too late to step back. He hadn't been hurt, and the situation hadn't escalated further, but that didn't erase the fact that he had been careless. The weight of that realization made him pause for a moment, standing on the edge of the street, watching as the guard and his horse remained in place, unmoved by the chaos that had momentarily surrounded them. The moment felt like a turning point. Alex had come to the city to see history, to experience something new and exciting. But what he hadn't expected was to learn something about himself. In his quest for adventure, he had forgotten the importance of respect for the traditions of others, for the animals involved, and for the people who took those traditions seriously. He had been blinded by the desire to capture a moment, but now he understood that some moments weren't meant to be captured on camera. They were meant to be experienced, quietly and with reverence. As he stood there, taking in the scene, Alex felt a shift in his perspective. He had been so caught up in the excitement of travel, in the thrill of experiencing something new, that he hadn't stopped to think about the deeper meaning of the places he visited. He hadn't stopped to think about the people and the customs that made those places what they were. Now, as he looked back at the guard and the horse, he realized how important it was to understand and respect those customs, to be aware of the significance of the things he encountered along the way. The moment, though uncomfortable, had been an important one. Alex had learned something valuable, something that would stay with him long after he left the city. He had learned that respect wasn't something to be taken lightly, and that it was something that had to be shown not just through words, but through actions. And as he walked away, he knew that he would carry that lesson with him, not just for the rest of his travels, but for the rest of his life. The world was full of moments that could teach him something, and he would be more careful in the future, more aware of the boundaries that existed, both for his safety and for the safety of those around him. As Alex walked away, his mind was still processing everything that had happened. The scene with the royal guard, and the horse was still fresh in his thoughts, and every step he took felt heavier than the last. He couldn't shake the feeling of discomfort, not just because of the close call, but because of the way he had been acting. It had taken this experience for him to realize how thoughtless he had been. But now, as he stepped further away from the scene, he began to reflect on what had just transpired. Alex walked along the crowded street, trying to calm his nerves. His surroundings had returned to their usual rhythm. The chatter of tourists, the sounds of street vendors calling out, the busy energy of a city that never seemed to slow down. But to Alex, everything felt different. He couldn't fully immerse himself in the hustle and bustle of the city anymore, not after what had just occurred. He kept replaying the guard's stern warning in his mind, and the realization that he had crossed a boundary he shouldn't have. He didn't know exactly why, but there was a part of him that felt almost ashamed. He hadn't come to the city with the intention of disrespecting anyone or anything. He was just here to explore, to take in the sights, to capture the beauty of the world around him. But now, he understood that there was more to travel than just seeing new places. There were deeper layers, unspoken rules that everyone should follow. Some things couldn't just be snapped into a picture. They needed to be understood, respected, and appreciated for what they were. Alex thought about the royal guard. The man had done his job so well, maintaining his composure even when it seemed like the situation could have gone south. Alex had crossed a line, but the guard had remained calm, didn't raise his voice, didn't act rashly. That professionalism had struck Alex, and it made him realize how much he had taken for granted. He had seen the guard as just another part of the scene, something to observe from a distance. But the guard wasn't a piece of the scenery. He was a person with a job, with responsibilities, and with a duty to uphold. And in that moment, the guard's calm, unwavering authority had been a lesson to Alex. Alex slowed his pace, his mind still working through the incident. He had come to the city excited, eager to explore. But now, he saw how much of the world he had yet to understand. It wasn't just about capturing moments with a camera. It was about learning to appreciate the history, the traditions, and the people who had lived in those places long before he had arrived. As Alex continued walking, he passed by more landmarks, more beautiful scenes that begged to be photographed. But today, he couldn't look at them the same way. The places he had been rushing to capture now seemed to ask more of him. They weren't just photo opportunities. They were places with deep meaning, full of culture and history. The faces of the people who lived here were not to be reduced to something captured in a snapshot for others to admire. They had their own stories, their own reasons for being there, and their own importance. He thought back to the horse, standing there calmly after he had backed away. It wasn't just a horse. It was part of something bigger, a symbol of tradition, an important member of the ceremony, and a creature that deserved respect. Alex had been too caught up in the idea of a perfect photograph to realize that he wasn't just taking a picture of a royal horse. He was interacting with something that had meaning, and in that moment, he had forgotten that meaning. He had been too focused on getting close, on getting the shot, to understand the context. But now, with the adrenaline fading, he understood how wrong he had been. He had underestimated the importance of respecting the space and the boundaries of those around him. Eventually, Alex found a bench near a quiet corner of the city. He sat down, the weight of the day's events sinking in. He hadn't expected to learn such a profound lesson on his travels, but it had hit him harder than he could have anticipated. He had always seen travel as an adventure, something to be enjoyed and experienced with an open mind. But he now realized that part of being open-minded meant respecting what others valued. Some moments weren't meant to be captured. They were meant to be understood. He pulled out his camera, looking at the pictures he had taken earlier in the day. They were beautiful, of course. The buildings, the streets, the people. But as he flicked through the images, they didn't feel as important as they had before. He couldn't help but feel that the pictures had been taken too hastily, too thoughtlessly. He wasn't sure if he would keep them. Something about those photos no longer felt right. They didn't represent the deeper meaning of what he had experienced. Alex sat there for a while, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He thought about the lesson he had learned. It wasn't just about respecting the people around him. It was about understanding the space he occupied, about understanding that traditions and cultures had their own significance, and that the world wasn't just a series of things to observe. The world was a place of meaning, of stories waiting to be heard. And Alex wanted to be someone who respected those stories, who listened and understood, rather than just capturing moments for the sake of a photograph. The more Alex thought about it, the more he realized that the lesson had been far greater than a simple apology to the guard. It was a turning point in his journey, one that would shape the way he approached the world moving forward. As he stood up from the bench, he felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt earlier in the day. He had learned something valuable, something that would stick with him for the rest of his travels. It was a lesson about respect, understanding, and the importance of seeing the world with more than just his eyes. It was about truly seeing the world for what it was, not just for what it looked like in a photograph. As Alex walked through the streets of the city, the events of the day kept swirling in his mind. The initial shock had worn off, and now, the experience was beginning to feel like a weight he couldn't quite shake. He had been humbled, yes, but there was also a sense of gratitude beginning to bloom within him. Gratitude for the lesson he had learned, though the way it had come to him was not the way he had anticipated. The streets of the city had not changed. They were still lively, full of energy, with the colorful storefronts and the rhythmic hum of life continuing around him. Tourists were snapping pictures, locals were chatting, and street performers were still playing their music. Yet everything seemed to have a new depth for Alex. The world around him had always been interesting, but now it felt like there was so much more to understand, so much more beneath the surface that he had failed to see before. He passed by a few familiar landmarks, but his focus had shifted. He no longer saw them simply as things to be photographed. Instead, he began to see them as part of a living history, full of meaning and stories, some of which were thousands of years old. The buildings, the statues, and the guards were all part of a tradition that had been handed down through generations. They weren't just objects in a scene for tourists to admire. They were symbols of a culture that deserved respect. And Alex, for the first time in a long while, felt like he had truly understood that. Alex found himself stopping in front of a small cafe that overlooked one of the city's most beautiful squares. The cafe's outdoor tables were full, and the smell of fresh coffee and pastries filled the air. It felt like the perfect place to sit and reflect. He didn't rush in. He simply took a seat at an empty table by the window. The warmth from the sun streamed in, and he sat there for a while, allowing the stillness to settle around him. For the first time today, he allowed himself a moment of peace. The cafe was a quiet place, away from the chaos of the streets. It was a little sanctuary in the heart of the city, and it gave Alex the space to breathe. He ordered a coffee, not because he was thirsty, but because he wanted to give himself a reason to sit still for a while. He had been on the move all day, chasing one experience after another, always seeking the next thrill, the next sight. But now it felt right to just pause, to let the city settle around him. As he sipped his drink, his mind returned to the royal guard and his horse. The image of the guard's unflinching stance was still vivid in his mind, and so was the horse, calm and composed despite everything that had just happened. Alex had underestimated them both. He had seen them as part of the scenery, a living display for tourists to admire. But now he saw them for what they truly were, symbols of something much deeper, something far more important than a tourist attraction. The guard was not just a soldier. He was a keeper of tradition, of history. The horse was not just a beautiful animal. It was a living representation of that same tradition. He thought about his reaction earlier, the way he had dismissed the guard's warnings. At the time, it had seemed so insignificant, so harmless. But now, Alex realized how much respect he had overlooked. Respect for the people who worked to preserve these traditions, respect for the rules that kept everything in balance, and respect for the animals that played such an important role. It was a lesson he would carry with him, not just on this trip, but in all his future travels. Alex took a slow breath and glanced out the window. The world outside had not changed. People were still walking by, still laughing, still enjoying their time in the city. But Alex had changed. The incident with the royal guard had opened his eyes to something he hadn't fully appreciated before. It wasn't just about visiting places and seeing new things. It was about understanding the deeper significance of those places, the cultural meaning they held, and the people who were part of them. He realized that for a long time, he had been too focused on the surface of things. He had always been eager to check places off his list, to snap the perfect picture, to get the best angle. But now, Alex understood that there was so much more to see than what was visible at first glance. The stories of the places he visited, the traditions that shaped them, the people who kept them alive. These were the things he needed to pay attention to. These were the things that would truly make his travels meaningful. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, Alex finished his coffee and stood up from the table. He felt lighter now, less burdened by the mistake he had made earlier. The weight of his regret had lifted, replaced by a quiet understanding. He had learned something valuable, and while it had come in an unexpected way, he was grateful for the lesson. He left the cafe and walked back toward the square, ready to continue his exploration of the city, but with a new sense of awareness. He didn't need to rush through the streets or capture every moment. Instead, he could take his time, absorb the surroundings, and truly appreciate the culture that lay beneath the surface. He could respect the boundaries and traditions that made this place what it was, and in doing so, he would experience the city in a way he never had before. The day had started with excitement and curiosity, but it was ending with a deeper sense of respect, not just for the place he was visiting, but for the people, the history, and the lessons he had learned along the way. As Alex walked through the streets, the world no longer seemed like a collection of snapshots to be taken. It felt like a story waiting to be understood, and he was ready to listen. As Alex wandered through the city, the weight of the day's events still lingered in the back of his mind. He had learned a valuable lesson, one that had caught him off guard and changed the way he saw not just the city, but the world around him. His steps were slower now, not out of exhaustion, but because he was savoring the present moment, taking it all in with a new perspective. The bustling streets, the ancient buildings, the laughter of tourists. It all seemed more alive now, more meaningful. It was as though the city itself had revealed something deeper to him, something he had been too distracted to notice before. Alex had always been someone who traveled quickly, ticking off boxes on his mental list of must-see places. He would take a photo here, capture a moment there, and then move on to the next location, always chasing the next adventure. But today, for the first time, he had stopped. He had been forced to confront his own behavior, his lack of awareness, and his failure to understand the significance of the things around him. It had been a humbling experience, but it had also been an eye-opening one. And now he felt a renewed sense of purpose in his travels. As he continued walking, Alex couldn't help but think about the royal guard and his horse. That image of the soldier standing firm, unwavering in the face of Alex's intrusion, kept coming back to him. The calm, yet powerful way the guard had handled the situation was something Alex would never forget. It wasn't just the guard's professionalism that had struck him. It was the respect he had for the tradition he was a part of. The guard wasn't just standing there as a formality. He was a protector of history, a keeper of the culture that had shaped this city for centuries. And the horse, too, had been a part of that story. It was not just an animal. It was a symbol of the continuity of tradition, a living connection to the past. Alex realized how little he had understood about the people and the places he visited. He had been so caught up in the thrill of the moment, in the excitement of being somewhere new, that he hadn't taken the time to stop and think about the significance of the traditions, the people, and the culture that made each place unique. He had seen everything through the lens of a tourist, but now he wanted to see the world as it truly was, complex, rich in history, and full of meaning. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the city, Alex felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had learned something that day, something that had changed the way he would approach his travels from now on. It wasn't just about collecting pictures or experiences. It was about understanding the deeper layers of the world, about respecting the boundaries that had been set by those who came before him. He realized that, in order to truly appreciate the places he visited, he needed to slow down and take the time to learn, to listen, and to understand. Alex paused for a moment to take in the view before him. The city stretched out in front of him, its buildings bathed in the soft light of the setting sun. People continued to walk by, going about their day, but Alex no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He felt connected to the place, to its history, and to the people who called it home. He had crossed a line that day, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable than any photograph or souvenir. He had gained a deeper appreciation for the world around him. He found himself at the edge of a park, where a fountain sat in the middle of a peaceful square. The sound of the water flowing was soothing, and Alex took a deep breath, letting the calmness of the moment wash over him. He had been so caught up in trying to capture the perfect experience, but now, he understood that sometimes the most meaningful moments were the ones you didn't try to control. The moments when you simply allowed yourself to be present, to take in everything around you, and to understand it for what it truly was. As he sat on a bench by the fountain, watching the people stroll by, Alex felt a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for the lessons he had learned, for the chance to reflect, and for the realization that travel wasn't just about seeing new places. It was about truly experiencing them, understanding their significance, and respecting the traditions that shaped them. He had learned that respecting the world around him meant slowing down, listening, and being mindful of the people and places he encountered. For the first time in a long time, Alex felt at peace with his journey. He no longer needed to rush to the next place, to tick off the next box on his list. He could simply enjoy the present, appreciating the city for all that it was and all that it represented. The incident with the royal guard had taught him something important, and it would stay with him for the rest of his travels. From that day on, Alex knew that he would approach the world with a new sense of respect. Respect for the history, for the people, and for the cultures that had shaped the world he was so eager to explore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, Halleck stood up from the bench and began to walk again, his steps lighter now. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't searching for the next great photo opportunity. He was simply walking, enjoying the beauty of the moment, knowing that he had learned something far more valuable than any photograph could ever capture.